If you think it's time to take a hammer to your bathroom scale and rip up the diet rulebook, well, welcome to Body Kindness. Hi, everyone. It's Rebecca Scritchfield, author of Body Kindness and host for this podcast. I'm a health at every size dietitian, a certified exercise physiologist, a former chronic dieter, and mom to 2 girls. Join me as I talk to guests about what it means to be good to ourselves and create a better life where well-being matters, not weight. Through these conversations, we'll reveal the challenging and surprising ways our culture keeps us searching for our worth and our appearance. So let's create a new view of health that's inclusive and built on compassion and respect for all bodies. Let's shake things up and let's change the game. It's almost time to mend. Mend is a course in radical self-acceptance and body kindness with yours truly and my good friend Rosie Molinari. Visit bodykindnessbook.com/mend to learn more about this 8-week program that you can do on your own time, including information about the live call and other perks and benefits of this program. Be sure to leave your name and email to get on the wait list. Now, when you do that, there is no obligation to buy, but we will actually send you an invitation to a free mini course called Connect that is all about befriending your body. So once again, visit bodykindnessbook.com/mend, leave your name and email. You'll get the course Connect right away, absolutely free. And you'll also get early information on how you can get in on Mend and decide at that time if it's right for you.
And so we have 2 things at play with food, that physiologically a child's body wants to get enough, but also if it becomes something that's forbidden, we'll seek it out because it has a higher value. So it's a complicated thing, and it's not so easy as a dietitian making a meal plan or a parent saying this is what you have to eat. You know, food is so multifaceted.
That was Anna Lutz. Anna is a nutrition therapist based in Raleigh, North Carolina, and she specializes in eating disorders in pediatric and family nutrition. She studied psychology at Duke University and has a master's of public health degree in nutrition from the University of North Carolina. Anna is passionate about family feeding and the non-diet approach in dietetics, as well as how schools can do no harm in their nutrition education. And she's got a great blog and pieces of writing that you can find at sunnysideupnutrition.com. So in this episode, I'm talking about body kindness in the family, and you're going to hear us chat about topics like how to approach food in the home that supports health at every size and why it's never a good idea to label foods as good or bad, how to support kids of all sizes, especially around food and nutrition and body image, how to talk about yourself and others' bodies with kids, and how to talk to children about nutrition at a developmentally appropriate level. So I think there's a little something for everyone, especially for parents or people who care about kids, to pick something away from these 2 dietitians and health and well-being experts who embrace health at every size. We know there's a lot of problems when it comes to how we talk about food and nutrition, how we think about it, coming from the nutrition community, coming from the medical community. So hopefully you'll get something you can take away from this conversation, some more reading that you can do, and really just to boost some hope and confidence in yourself and in your family that when we focus on body kindness, when we focus on well-being, we leave the weight alone and we focus on habits and compassion and kindness. And even if it's about making changes in our lives, that it comes from a place of love and connection and caring, with positivity and not shame. So we hope we tackle some of these important topics for you in this podcast episode, and hope you enjoy the show. Anna, welcome to Body Kindness. Thanks for coming on today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so thrilled to be here.
I am excited too, and I just want to let listeners know how you and I know each other. Anna is someone I've always looked up to because of her expertise, particularly in the area of kids. I think listeners would appreciate knowing a little bit more about your background and what you currently do.
Great. So I'm a registered dietitian in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I spend good part of my time working one-on-one with people with eating disorders. And I also really enjoy working with parents of young children that may have some need extra support around feeding. And so that's not a huge part of my practice, but I love that part of my practice. I think of it as prevention work. If a child's having trouble eating at the beginning of their life, if we can approach the feeding in a certain way, we might prevent eating issues later in life.
Yeah. Can you give an example of that?
Well, I guess the thing that pops into my mind would be a child in elementary school who the parents or doctor is concerned that their weight has accelerated rapidly. And so they might be referred to me because of this concern. And so I would work directly with the parents, not with the child, and do a really clear assessment of if there is a concern, if there has been an acceleration of weight off of that child's growth curve. And if there has, what might be going on. And if there hasn't, if this is a child that has a larger body than their peers, how the parents can approach talking about food and bodies, just because of the world that we live in, that child may unfortunately have a harder time hearing those messages outside of the home.
Yeah. And that is exactly where I want to dive in with you. I am so happy to have this conversation. It is so necessary. As a fellow clinician, there is the unnecessary pain and suffering that we see in the homes. It can be really, really heartbreaking. And I'm the same. I start with the parent as well. And that you can get a lot of information from talking to parents directly. And they're also a product of diet culture, and they might be trying to do the best they can. I've had clients where there's major issues going on. Well, the mom had an eating disorder and got to a certain place to do the best she could, but still has her own issues. And then the dad didn't have an eating disorder, but has been a product of our diet culture and sort of patriarchal women should look a certain way. And so it can be really nasty and terrifying and difficult. And the one who's going to suffer the most is going to be the child. So take us in there and let's maybe start outside in, right? Let's talk about the culture and what's wrong with the culture and why it creates such a problem in the home.
Well, what comes to mind first for me is the pressure that parents are under from our culture right now to feed their child in a certain way and to control their child's weight in a certain way. And I feel like this comes from well-meaning medical providers, comes from friends on the playground talking about what they feed their children, or it just seems to be everywhere that there's this part of being kind of, quote, a super mom is to have children that are thin and children that eat superfoods. And I just think this pressure that's being put on parents is really like it's never been, historically speaking. And so parent that may in their gut know that their child is growing how they're supposed to, if they go to the pediatrician and the pediatrician says, your child is too big, then they feel like to be a good mom, they need to do something about it. And it's somehow a reflection of their own parenting that their child is in a larger body. And so it just creates this really sad situation, both for the parent, but also, of course, for the child.
Well, and so if this is happening at the pediatrician's office, the medical practitioner's office, I mean, what they're using the tools, basically growth chart tools, right? So what might we want to help parents understand about that? Right. The doctors, we expect we should trust 100%, right? They're supposed to know, and they're only supposed to give us the correct advice, and we're supposed to just shut up and listen. But that's not exactly what happens. So how can you help them understand?
Right. I think as a majority, most medical providers are taught about BMI cutoffs or weight for age cutoffs. And so that if a child comes in and their weight for age, and so yes, we're talking about growth charts, are above a certain percentile, then they're taught to express concern to the parent. But what you and I know from research and from Health at Every Size research is that all bodies, of course, grow differently. And that growth chart should really be read only for that child. We should be comparing a child's growth chart only to themselves. So if you have a child that's always been at the 85th percentile weight for age, and at age 10, they come in and they're still at the 85th percentile or 95th or above the 100th, that they've always been on their growth curve. They're growing just how they're intended. And if you go to the pediatrician's office and there's been a big veering off of their growth, whether they've always been at the 85th and now they're at the 75th, or they've always been at 85th and now they're at the 100th, that's a reason just to kind of stop and pause and try to do a clear assessment if there's something interfering with their growth, or maybe they've had a growth spurt. Maybe they've also crossed percentile lines, height for age. But that's probably the biggest thing, that there's a difference in a lot of how medical providers are educated, is that we really need to be reading growth charts, but we need to be reading them for that particular child and comparing that child to their own growth history.
Yeah. And just while I hope that this has changed or will change, but in my experience, there is a big lack of education in the medical community, both in training and continuing education, on concepts of size diversity and health at every size and weight stigma and the harmful impacts of weight stigma. And so the doctors actually don't have the tools that they necessarily would need to provide helpful information without causing harm. And so what happens is, even if there is a change, without a calm assessment and approach in place, without having a really solid plan for how we care for individuals and families, if we have any concerns for well-being, without that in place, it is what's likely going to unfold is shame, blame.
Because of this atmosphere and of everyone being scared of, quote, and this is in quotes, the obesity epidemic, that doctors are just so trained to kind of almost set off an alarm, like, oh my goodness, this is happening. And like you said, it creates all this shame and blame within the family that can lead to pressure on the child. It can lead to restrictive feeding in the home, which we know that restrictive feeding can actually accelerate children's weight. It can also lead to sneak eating or other disordered eating behaviors. And as you've mentioned, weight stigma. So if the goal in all of this alarm is for children's health, then the tactics that we seem to be using in conventional medicine, I would argue, is actually causing harm rather than helping.
Yeah. And layered on top of that is the issues of socioeconomic status that can limit one's access to resources, be it time or financial resources, to take action on the types of changes that a doctor would even recommend. And we're basically, as a culture, completely oblivious to that as well.
That's so true. And just having access to food. We know that food insecurity really affects how people feed their children, how people eat, behaviors around food. And so I think that's such an important piece that a lot of us are not talking about. So I'm so glad you bring it up.
Yeah. It's not true that our weight is 100% within our individual control, or that a higher weight is a less healthy weight. But we get those messages that can then be reinforced by the medical community. And it's, like we said, it's a big disservice. But you mentioned restriction in the home. And so I want to unpack that a little bit more.
When I think about restriction, I think of kind of two things. I think of physical restriction. So a person, and in this case, a child, not getting enough food. And so we know that food is one of our 5 basic needs. And so if any of our 5 basic needs, food, water, shelter, air, and what am I missing? Sleep. And sleep. If any of those are limited, our body and our mind wants to make sure we get it. And so we will focus on what we're missing. We will only think about that. We will overcompensate once we do get a hold of any of those things. If I kept you awake for 48 hours, if you could finally go to sleep, you're going to sleep for a really long time. Or if you held your breath, the next time you take a breath, you're going to take a really big breath. And so if we restrict food, it's in our being that when we do have access to food, we're going to eat, and we're going to eat probably more than we need to overcompensate that restriction. And so I think of that physical effect, feeding in a restrictive way, but I also think of the psychological effect of restriction, that if anything is off limits, that it has more value to us. And so there's been developmental psychological research where if we take a child in a room of toys and we say, you can play with any toy, but you can't play with the red truck, every child will eventually play with that red truck because the value of it has increased because it was off limits. And so we have two things at play with food, that physiologically a child's body wants to get enough, but also if it becomes something that's forbidden, we'll seek it out because it has a higher value. So it's a complicated thing, and it's not so easy as a dietitian making a meal plan or a parent saying this is what you have to eat. Food is so multifaceted.
Yeah. And it requires patience to unravel all of that if you get this sort of inappropriate alert and panic from the doctor and then inadequate support, that can also be very problematic.
I feel like if it's such an important thing for your listeners to hear is the world, our diet culture is so focused on weight. But if we can really take a deep breath and think, what are my child's behaviors around food? And in some cases, there may be some concerning behaviors around food, and that's something with the support of really good professionals that can be worked on. But any size child deserves to have enough food. Any size child deserves to eat a variety of food and to grow up to have a healthy relationship with food. And so if we can shift this focus from weight to behaviors, then parents in their minds can have a different outline to kind of measure things by.
What is the approach? What is the way? Walk us through that.
I would certainly meet with the parent without the child. Mm-hmm. If this is a child that's under, I would say 14 or 15, mm-hmm. that I'm really starting with the parents and doing a few things. We're first assessing, is there a problem? Mm-hmm. And I kind of wanted to add, when you said kind of that shame, I also, when I think about the parents that are coming in my office, they're feeling like they've done something wrong, mm-hmm. that this certainly has to be their fault, that doctor has waved their finger in their face and said, you've done something wrong. Your child has gained too much weight or is in a larger body. And so we're kind of dealing with that. But I think the first thing we do is really talk through what is going on with the child's eating behaviors. So have they seen a change in eating behaviors where a child may be eating as a response to different emotions? And so again, a lot of what I'm assessing with the family is, what are those behaviors, but also what are the feeding practices in the home? Is there dieting messages? I really operate from a framework of using Satter's division of responsibility in feeding. So this is a framework that I use. Ellen Satter is someone who's really kind of pioneered a lot of childhood feeding research. And so kind of to break it down, the division of responsibilities, that the parents have certain jobs and the children have certain jobs. So the parents' jobs are to decide when it's time to eat and what is offered and where it's going to be offered. So it's dinner time, and dinner's around 6 o'clock. We're going to have lasagna and salad and a glass of milk, and we're going to eat at the table. And then once the parents have done their job, they take a really deep breath and they really allow the children to do their jobs, which is to decide if they're going to eat of the different items that are offered and how much. And so a lot of times, by the time they've gotten to me, they've gotten a lot of advice, and they may be limiting how much their child is getting. So they've taken over that job and are restricting the portions of certain foods. Or they might be fixing their child an alternative, if it's kind of short order cooking, where they might be having a family meal, but the child is refusing that. And so they make them something else as an alternative. And so that we might be kind of working through what's going on in the home and what dynamics are there. A big part of the division of responsibility is sit down snacks. And so that children come to the dinner table or come to different meals hungry. And so that might be another thing we're looking at is there a nice size afternoon snack that has some carbohydrates and protein and fat in it. A lot of times if a parent is concerned about a child's weight, they may be giving them pretty low fat, smaller snacks or not a whole lot in their lunchbox. And so by the time they get home or by the time it's dinner time, they're ravenous. Mm-hmm. And we kind of create this deprivation cycle. And so when I'm doing an assessment, I'm really trying to understand what are the rules in the home? What do meal times look like? What do the behaviors of the child look like? What are the parents' beliefs about different types of foods?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. For a second you mentioned, I don't know if you said exactly emotional eating, but I remember I heard in my mind emotional eating or non-hunger eating. And I think that's something a lot of people don't fully grasp is like, what's like developmentally appropriate and like age appropriate. I'm going to use my daughter, Audrey. She loves chocolate. She loves Nutella. And chocolate chips make her happy. When she generally gets chocolate chip waffles, like literally every day. And some days she can house 5 and other days she eats a little bit less. And we notice just naturally when she has mornings where she eats well, she's less hungry later and she kind of goes with the flow.
I truly believe that children are born intuitive eaters, but it may not be how the general population defines what an intuitive eater is. And the way I think about it is children, and the research really backs this up, that children can self-regulate. And if they have that kind of structure set up, they may have, if chocolate chip waffles are their favorite food, and that's what is for dinner, they may eat a lot of chocolate chip waffles, but over the next few days, they're going to kind of self-regulate that. Or they might have for dinner lasagna and they hate lasagna and they don't eat very much, but the next morning they're going to have breakfast and eat a lot more.
Right.
And we have to, as parents, trust their bodies and trust that children do have this innate ability. And it's really that diet culture and a focus on weight is what interferes with that and honestly kind of messes it up. And that's why we have to, as adults, often kind of go back and relearn intuitive eating.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to have a better understanding of like, hey, of course, it makes sense that when desserts are offered that they're super excited about desserts and that they want more, or you come home from the store and you brought several options of things and that they get super excited. Like they're associating something that they like the taste of with a memory of pleasure. They're building a positive association around food, and that's nothing to fear about. And again, like you said, with the vision of responsibility, that kind of helps provide age-appropriate structure that helps kids as best they can kind of understand and trust and self-regulate themselves around food. But like to expect that like maybe adult where you talked about really eating slowly and mindfully and fully connecting and embracing, that those may be things that just kids are not as cognitively tuning into as much of just, yes, that sort of, positive connection and trust and feeling. I know when I need energy and I know how to ask for it. Go ahead.
I think what you're highlighting is that emotional eating is part of being a human, and that it's okay to be really happy and eat, and it's okay to be really sad and eat. Kind of what I was referring to earlier, just to kind of clarify that for your listeners, is maybe we have a kid who has a lot of anxiety and something happens at school, and that parent may notice their eating changes in response to that anxiety. Maybe they've really stopped eating as much, or maybe when they get really, really, really anxious, maybe they turn to food to cope. And that change or that kind of ongoing way to use food to cope with emotions may be something to look at. And I also tell parents it's very resourceful. It does change the chemicals in our brain, and it's an easy way for children to do that. But there might be other ways, of course, to cope with anxiety or other pressures.
Oh, absolutely. No, that's a really great point. And also dissecting, and as a clinician, we would dissect to kind of make sure that the house wasn't restrictive anyway. I remember this poor little girl eating cupcakes kind of under the soccer team table at her brother's soccer game. And the mom's like, what do I do? And she's like, but I never get this, and it's like, hey, I'd be sad too if the only thing I got was like 99% dark chocolate or Fig Newtons or something like that. So just sort of understanding the root of the issue can be the rigidity.
And it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? That a parent's like, well, my child eats anytime she's around cupcakes, she eats a ton of them. So we can't have them. And then the few times you have them, she eats a ton of them because they've been restricted. But they use that as kind of the evidence. And so it's a hard thing to convince people, but it really, really is the truth that within structure, offering all foods, that children can self-regulate.
Yeah. Yeah. And when you do that, right, So I've seen this too. They do that and they'll cross their fingers, like just eat one, you know, like sort of hoping that they'll do the thing that they want them to do. You know, I remember a mother and son I had, she was upset with the amount of steak he took at like a family where her brother was there. And she literally said, like, it embarrassed me how much steak you took. And he's like, well, you know, we never get steak and I was hungry. So he was kind of like, what he was saying was making lots of sense to me. And we ended up doing this. It was like a steak challenge or something, you know, where it was just like to get the mom to trust, like literally steak is nutritious and this is something your son likes and the myths around red meat. So let's offer it more regularly, then talk about, I have room, I want more steak. So just kind of building that language around that. It's also important, while we understand you might feel, oh, I really hope that my son or daughter does something specific, like they may not. And how to sit with that discomfort is also a problem.
That's so true. It's so true. And it makes me think of, as children become teenagers, it can become then this kind of, or even younger, I suppose, but this more parental battle. Like, it makes you really mad when I get a big piece of steak. Watch me get a big piece of steak. You know what I mean?
You can't control me.
And so I tell parents, why don't we argue about clothes, like what they're wearing, or, you know, different. Let's not argue about, there's too much baggage with food. You know, there's other things for parents and teenagers to argue about. I feel like it comes up a lot with young or teenage children that are thin, that sometimes there's this, well, from parents, this like, well, you're thin and you can eat however you want, or there's a value, whether it's said in words or just implied, that the parents value them in some way because they're thin, that a sensitive child takes that and thinks that that's really, really important for them to stay that way, and can become fearful of that. I'm thinking of a particular client I worked with that really felt like that was her value because that was what was commented on within her family all the time. And so she was very scared to eat because she was worried her body would change. I think it's just really important to kind of stop and think about how bodies are talked about in your home. And like you said, you can always start from this point going forward. I just feel like all of us parents just do the best we can every day. So I never want to make parents feel like they've done something wrong or they've caused some terrible thing for their child, but more just thinking, how do we talk about bodies? And do we focus on, is there a focus on how bodies look? And that could be a parent commenting on his or her own body weight or body size, or it could be comments of somebody walking down the street or somebody on TV or somebody in a picture. How do we talk about people? And I'm a real big proponent that modeling is the most important thing, that just how we talk about bodies every day is way more important than for us to say, okay, we don't talk about bodies with people's weight.
Yes.
You know what I mean? That to use those words.
Well, you're basically upholding the taboo, right? Like, we just don't comment.
Right, exactly. And we all have different abilities, but that focus on what our bodies do for ourselves, how smart our bodies are, how our bodies change. But more than anything, just that children don't hear parents criticize their own bodies. You know, what I think about is most children look somewhat like their parents in general. Of course, there's different situations with people being adopted or different things. But if you have a parent that looks just like you and that parent is always criticizing their own body, that really has an effect on the child and teaches them that that's what adults do, is criticize their bodies.
At least for me, I find, like, in the online circles and parenting groups where I am, that this comes up a lot, just sort of what kind of language and what do we say in the family. And I just find that the avoidance of having conversations is the worst thing that you can do. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I really feel that if a child is coming to a parent and saying, I am fat, so the child's talking about themselves, what I really encourage parents to do is just to start asking questions. Like you said, the gut reaction is to say, no, you're not. You know, why would you say that? But more to say, well, you know, tell me about that. And so that you're staying really neutral, but you're really trying to understand what this child is trying to tell you. A different situation is hearing a child comment on someone else's body. And the question for me is it done in a mean way, a criticism, a laughing way, or is it an observation? I think it's really common for young children, 2, 3, 4-year-olds, to note they're trying to figure out the world. And they may say, hey, mommy, look, that person's fat. And, that it's a descriptor, and to model like, yes, you're right. That it's in a situation that feels appropriate to not say, oh, don't say that, because you've already taught the child that that's a bad thing. But if the older child is laughing or criticizing someone, to really talk about, we don't criticize people's bodies, and all bodies are different. And, yes, some bodies are fat and some bodies are thin, and to kind of have that conversation. But it's really nuanced. I had a call a few weeks ago from a friend who is an elementary school teacher, and she had an incident in her class where a little girl came up and said, so-and-so called me fat. And she said, all I could think about was, what would Anna tell me to do in this situation?
That's a compliment.
Which made me feel very, very good. But we had to have this whole conversation that it was done in a mean way. And so she needed to comfort this child and figure out what's going on. She didn't need to say, like, oh, well, fat's not a bad thing.
Right.
You know what I mean? That was probably not the situation necessarily to do that. It really that this was an upset child that someone had made fun of, and making fun of someone is not okay.
Right. Yeah. And whether it is teasing or bullying, right, which I would put on a spectrum, it is to be taken seriously, and it is to be addressed in quick and appropriate fashion, because that is, then we're really getting deeper into mental health territory. Everything we've been talking about absolutely today is associated with and feeds into mental health and well-being. But there are also hard lines on boundaries on what is and is not okay, and how we talk about other people's bodies. And that can be a real thing that comes up for families and schools and everything. So that's a good example. Speaking of schools, I have to tell you a quick little story and get your take on it.
Okay.
So somebody posted on a group I was in, like, help me help this mom. And the mom was like, I guess there's some sort of like health and wellness week at the school. I honestly don't even know what age range. I remember I was getting curious about that. There was this list of like things they were going to talk about, and was kind of like, well, of course what we eat is important. And so it really looked actually really disorganized, but when I deciphered it, it was like, okay, so I think they're trying to talk about added sugar with kids. And I don't know the exact age ranges or whatnot, which I think makes a significant difference. But on their list was like, grapes.
Oh my God.
And it was like, grapes are sweet. And so literally limit grapes. And then there was something like dried fruits are really sweet, and like limit those, and even do unsweetened yogurt. And so clearly I was like, wow, this is looking really policey, and this is coming from the school. And so I just know that this is an area that a lot of parents struggle with. Again, I think whoever's running stuff at schools are well-meaning, but this is also kind of sticky territory, boundary type issues. So what can you share insight as far as like what schools should and shouldn't do, or just in these scenarios, what sort of sense of control do parents have that might help?
Yes. As you know, this is really one of my sticking points, is how diet culture has really infiltrated our schools and how we talk to kids about nutrition education. And I really believe it's because of all this fear around large bodies. Something that I talk about a lot is what is age-appropriate nutrition education. And so that nutrition is a very abstract field, that you can't see nutrients in food. I guess the example I always like to use is that you and I can understand it's absolutely appropriate and wonderful to have birthday cake at a birthday party. And we can understand that we probably don't want to have birthday cake for every meal, that we would be missing out on nutrients our body needs. We can understand that. But a concrete thinker, a young child under about age 11 or 12 or 13, that range, they can't understand or translate these very abstract concepts. So some children hear cake is bad and they think I can never have cake or I'm going to get sick. Or the other example I love is I've worked with a child that came to me and said, I hear carrots are good for your eyes and I do not like carrots and I'm so scared I'm going to become blind. that they've taken this very kind of concrete fact and tried to apply it to themselves. Wow. And so I feel like that's where we are right now, is that we're wanting to teach children these very kind of adult ideas, and either it goes right over their head, or for more sensitive children, it really affects how they eat and just how they think about food. What you're referring to sounds, like you said, kind of policey. And I don't know if that handout was directed towards the parents, do you think?
Well, it was interesting because I guess that they were talking about, like we're doing some stuff for like the adults, the teachers and educators, and we'll be doing stuff for kids. And so, I can't say for sure, like she didn't share, she shared like text, right? So that I think was part of an email exchange, or I don't know, something. So it's not like, I know for sure there's this kid's handout that's saying, don't do grapes. I mean, I guess from my standpoint, I don't know how that would be helpful for a parent either. But yeah, I mean, I just think that I certainly have had my own experiences with limited, but like some local schools, like, we're doing this wellness thing, and we're going to show some documentary, just a horrible Forks Over Knives or whatever, but just some sort of documentary, and we're going to read the book Food Rules, so it literally demonizes anything processed. And just the idea that how do you know what you're going to do wouldn't cause harm, right? Yes. I think that's a concern. And the parents' autonomy you have a right to know, what do you plan to put in front of my child, because I have a right to protect them if I think that what you're doing is not good for them, whether it's an alternate activity or something. I just got to think that people feel powerless, and it's not necessarily a powerless situation, and that it does happen, and it is real unfortunate that the intentions might be there, but it might not be helpful.
Yes. And that parents have the right to decide what foods they serve. That it sounds like whoever made this handout you're referring to doesn't even make kind of nutrition sense, first of all. But let's say if it did, that every parent, based on how their family operates, based on their socioeconomic status, based on lots of different factors, they have the right to decide either what goes in the child's lunch, or if they buy their lunch or take their lunch to school, that what's healthy, quote unquote, healthy for one person may not be for another person. And so it's just when the schools become in this kind of policing role where they're saying what snacks are, quote, okay or not okay. Or the other thing that comes up at my children's school is what order the children are allowed to eat what's in their lunch.
Really?
Yeah. So getting back in my son's lunch, the mandarin orange little cups, and they were unopened. I let it go for a while. I try not to comment what comes back in the lunchbox because that could put pressure. Mm-hmm. But just one day I was like, am I sending a fork? Do I keep forgetting to send a fork? He was like, no, I don't like to eat those because my teacher tells me I'm not allowed to drink the juice out of them.
Wow.
I was like, wow, okay. This makes me think of the feeding doctor's wonderful lunchbox card that's on her website. Katja Raleigh has that really neat lunchbox card that you can stick in your child's lunch. It says, let my child eat their lunch in whatever order or however they want. Because I do think that's a trend of people in the cafeteria kind of saying how the children should be eating.
It is not easy being responsible for, even our own eating patterns and how we might evolve and things. So we have ourselves and our family. So acknowledging that it's not easy, but that also that the way our culture sets things up for us, it can make it even harder. And what are some sort of parting pointers or what you would want listeners to take home from our conversation today?
What a good question. That really kind of focusing on providing, and that's really probably a quote from Ellen Satter, providing, not depriving. That when we can kind of take a deep breath and remind ourselves it's not our job as the parent to control our child's body, but it is our job to feed them and expose them to a variety of foods and model taking care of our own bodies. And it doesn't have to be elaborate. It does not have to be picture perfect. It can be quick meals sometimes. It can be afternoon snack can be a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Mm-hmm. I do agree with you that afternoon snack is quite important for growing children, but it doesn't have to be one more meal that you're trying to kind of crank out. I think the other part to really remember, and you just touched on this, is that children's needs are just so different than adults. And there's so many factors that go on there. But to remember that children oftentimes do need to eat quite a bit because they're growing, because they're involved in sports. And so their needs are just really, really different than adults' needs. And probably more than anything, just to kind of know that that you can really think about how you want to approach food and nutrition in your own home, and that you might really get pushback or different messages outside of your home, but that you can decide what's right for you, and that the messages within your home really speak louder for your children than anything else. Right when my oldest children started going to elementary school, anytime they came home and told me some dieting message they heard, I would just get so upset. But as time has gone, I've realized that they're going to hear these things, but what they model day in and day out is setting a foundation for what's important. And those things are able to kind of roll off their back a little bit more, which is great.
Keeping in mind that the way diet culture hijacks wellness, right? Yeah. So that for some of us, right, this idea of like a more nourishing snack can sound like there is an opportunity for getting foods that deliver proteins and fats and a sweet food that might have a fruit in it and to be substantial. And that in that same frame, it also might remind you of, well, be that sort of like rejection of diet culture. And so if that does come up too, right, that sort of reframe, we might have been bruised by past experiences, but we can be present and think about taste and enjoyment and satisfaction. And some of that might be exploring more, quote, healthful food options and how the flavor pairings work out for you, and give yourself some time to evolve into this sort of reframe of this isn't, I'm not back on Whole30 again or something, right? This is just sort of a trusting, compassionate, and loving way to provide a variety of healthy foods to kids.
Yes, I love the idea of focusing on compassion for everyone, for the parents, for the children. And if a parent is struggling with their own eating or struggling moving away from diets, doing a lot of the things we talked about today for themselves, sitting down with their child for their afternoon snack is a great idea, and giving yourself the chance to listen to hunger and fullness. Or I sometimes talk with adults about kind of using these strategies of the division of responsibility with themselves and kind of parenting themselves in the same way they parent their child around food, which feels like compassion to me.
Yes, absolutely. And just connecting, we love our kids, right? And so, we love our kids. We got to direct love at ourselves, and we're not going to be perfect. We'll figure it out. We'll work it out. And you don't have to believe every person who sounds like they know what they're talking about. You can decide, is that helpful for me or not?
So true. So true.
So where can people find you to connect with you and just kind of make sure that they're following all the good things you have to offer?
Great. Thank you. Well, I've just started a blog that I'm super excited about with my friend who's also a dietitian, Elizabeth Davenport. It's Sunny Side Up Nutrition. So www.sunnysideupnutrition.com. And so we're writing about a lot of what you and I have spoken about today. I'm doing a lot of talking about how to talk to children about food and bodies. And Elizabeth is a former chef. So she's talking about more of recipes and cooking and very easy, how to get things on the table easily. And so that's a resource that's out there for any parents that are kind of on this path of having a non-diet approach in their home. And then I also can be found on Instagram at Anna Lutz RD, both on Instagram and Twitter at Anna Lutz RD. Anyone's welcome to email me at anna@lutzandalexander.com. So that's my private practice in Raleigh, is Lutz and Alexander Nutrition Therapy.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you so much. I've loved it.
And that's a wrap on today's show. Let's continue the conversation on Facebook. Just search Body Kindness Podcast and click to join. And if you can contribute to the production costs for the 2018 podcast season, visit gofundme.com/bodykindness. We love ratings and reviews. Please do that. And don't forget to let your friends know that Body Kindness is one of your can't miss podcasts. If you have questions, comments, or guest recommendations, shoot me an email, Rebecca@bodykindnessbook.com.